Hello, my name is Chris Morris and this is my second programme for Flipping the Pyramid Radio. The website, if you wish to look at Flipping the Pyramid, is flippingthepyramid.co.uk. If you go into the chat room on the Flipping the Pyramid website, then you'll see numerous links that have been posted by myself that relate to this programme and give you further information on the topics that are being discussed. This programme will also be available in the future through YouTube if you wish to listen to it again after you listen to the live edition, and it's always available shortly after broadcast on the Flipping the Pyramid website via Mixcloud. Last week I was discussing the global economic system, how it came to pass, the effects that it's had on the society and culture, and how this was really not something that's happened due to organic factors, although I'm sure organic factors have contributed, but that it was really connived by a series of elite financial, banking and corporate interests over a period of decades. As a footnote to that, this week, I work as a freelance writer and editor and proofreader, and this week I was asked to fact check, edit and proofread a report about globalisation. And during last week's programme I was talking about the Bretton Woods system. That was right near the start of the programme, and I was saying I didn't have the figures in front of me regarding how much gold had to be, how currency was fixed against American dollar, which was in turn fixed against gold. This was the gold standard. Ironically, this report that I've been editing and fact-checking does discuss this issue, and it also discusses numerous other issues. This is an academic report that is being produced by well, I can't give the name of the person involved because it hasn't been published yet, but I'm going to actually read from this report because it is a good kind of footnote to what was being discussed last week and gives some indication of some of the kind of topics that I was going into and how they're not contentious in any way. These are just established facts that are part of the historical record and cannot possibly be denied. So I'm going to read briefly from this report. Unfortunately, I can't provide a link to this because it hasn't been published yet, but I'll read from it, and it should become clear the relevance to what I was discussing last week. Following World War II, the Bretton Woods system provided the foundation for international finance throughout the industrialised world. It coordinated currencies by instituting pegged exchange rates. Just to explain that briefly, you might occasionally hear people say dollar peg, and all that means is that exchange rates are pegged against, they call it pegging against the dollar. It's a technical term, but it just means that the exchange rates are securitized against the particular currency. So I'll just reread that. It coordinated currencies by instituting pegged exchange rates, which the IMF was tasked with overseeing. The value of each currency was fixed against the American dollar, and in turn the dollar was worth $35 per ounce of gold. Some have called the subsequent quarter century a golden age of controlled capitalism. Under Bretton Woods there wasn't another depression, Europe was able to rebuild successfully, exchange rates were stable and inflation was low. However, tension within the currency system built throughout the 1960s. This is debatable. And in 1971, I would argue that wasn't the real factor that led to the suspension of the gold standard at all. But I mean, that's kind of the mainstream academic view, and it's a view that has some credibility. In 1971, the United States suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. By 1973, nations stopped setting their currency's value to a fixed rate against others, meaning that currencies within the system started to float. Obviously, this is the way the system works today. If you sit and watch the BBC News or any other mainstream news programme, you'll see them discussing, the pound's gone up against the euro's gone down against the dollar's gone up against the yen. What's the yen done? This is what it means by the flotation of currency. The Bretton Woods system of pegged exchange rates was over. After this is a key section. After this, oil prices rose steeply in the 1970s, contributing to inflationary pressures, and the decade was characterised by economic instability, relatively low growth and high inflation. International capital mobility increased in some advanced nations. Well, I mean, that was a very minor positive outcome. So if you go back and if you look at, as I say, the graph in terms of the value of the dollar is absolutely plummeted since 1971. In addition to that, things like the retail price index of the United States, which measures the price of consumer goods, it looks like a reverse ski jump slope. It just goes shooting up from the 1970s, and you'll find many economic indicators that greatly impact upon the general public, that really determine the standard of living of the general public. They'll become negative from this point in time. As I said last week, I'm not entirely sold on the gold standard and the Bretton Woods system in terms of being an ideal monetary system that is sustainable over a long period of time and that is going to work in the favour of most people, and that is something that should be held up as a really esteemed thing. But I know that it's considerably better than what is in place at present, and all the financial indicators and all the economic indicators that we have would point to that. I mean, what I would argue happened in the 1970s was that this was in a post-Vietnam the United States. It was simply the case that the US wanted to expand their empire and expand all the, there were corporate and banking interests that I discussed last week that really wanted to see the kind of action that had been taking place over the last 20 years expand more rapidly and on a more sort of theatre-wide basis, so that America was going into multiple theatres at a given time, which has resulted today in them having 130 military bases having military bases in 130 various countries. So this wouldn't have been achievable on the gold standard. So Nixon was essentially encouraged to suspend the gold standard so that they could just keep borrowing the money to fund the war machine, which is what I described last week. A more mainstream view, as discussed in this report, is that it was due to currency pressures. I wouldn't really agree with that, but I'm sure that it could have been a contributing factor. The report goes on to discuss the 1990s, so I'll just read that section out because, again, it's of great relevance to what I was discussing last week. Deep international financial integration programs persisted throughout the 1990s and afterwards. The IMF and World Bank commonly advised struggling lower or middle-income countries to follow the, quote, Washington Consensus. This paradigm was derived from the prevailing conventional wisdom among Washington, D.C. policymakers involved in foreign economic development issues. In practice, the Washington Consensus advocated market austerity measures that included trade liberalisation, open capital flows, minimal inflation — that didn't work — reduced public spending, fiscal discipline, privatisation and deregulation. So just briefly worth looking at those measures before I continue reading this. So you've got trade liberalisation, obviously discussed massively last week, open capital flows, in other words, give corporations the opportunity to borrow as much as they possibly can, and capital flows means from one country into another. It's often described as foreign direct investment, and this is, as I was discussing last week, it's greatly detrimental to a country's native industries, because once you get open capital flows, all the biggest corporations in the world can start to dominate the industries of each country, which is what's happened. It's no coincidence. Reduced public spending. This hasn't actually happened at all, of course. Public spending in the United States remains $1.3 trillion in the red. Public spending in Britain is several hundred million. I think it's approximately £150 million at the moment in the red, and that's after there's been this huge programme of slashing expenditure, slashing public spending, of closing down everything we possibly could, of saying, we can't afford to do this, we can't afford to do that, we can't afford for people to go to employment tribunals anymore, we can't afford to keep small libraries open, we can't afford to do anything. And yet, despite this, there was an article published recently, I think it was in the Daily Telegraph, that stated that Britain's public borrowing and spending has increased under this Conservative government. So the reduced public spending didn't really happen. I mean, certainly public spending on welfare and benefit can be shown to have decreased greatly over this period. Public spending on the military it will be harder to show a decrease. Of course, the United States is, in particular, their military spending is off the chart, is increased exponentially, particularly since 9/11 and the beginning of the quote-unquote war on terror. So then the last two things which I discussed last week to a certain extent, I didn't discuss privatisation too much because I'd like to do a programme entirely benefit to the privatisation of public, what should be public utilities and so forth at some point. But obviously privatisation is beneficial to the private sector, it's beneficial to corporations, it's beneficial to, in Britain we've seen the privatisation of even basic services like the benefit system with companies like A4E, Atos and Serco being given plum contracts to take over and run things like the work programme. Again, that's something I'd like to discuss in a programme at a later date. And the last thing was deregulation. We were discussing this again last week. Stuff like the GATT agreements continually favoured the deregulation of the financial environment. A famous example of this from a latter period of history was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which I think was in 1999. This was an American law which prevented investment banking and retail banking from being. They were what is often referred to as being ring-fenced, i.e. they were separated. There were no such laws in Britain, but there was and there never have been. But there was a law in the United States stating that these two entities had to remain separate. Of course, since the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, investment banks have gone absolutely crazy, and this has really been one of the fundamental causes of the quote-unquote financial crisis. It's not really a crisis at all, but this is one of the fundamental reasons that there have been so many problems, is the completely savage behaviour of investment banks all over the world, particularly American investment banks, the big four, including JP Morgan Chase, have been particularly, you could say selfish would be the most positive spin you could put on it. So I'll just continue reading from this article because it continues to go on some interesting subjects I'm just going to briefly discuss. In terms of budgetary policy, this regimen frequently recommended that emerging economy governments lower spending and reduce fiscal deficits, even during periods of crisis. It was embraced after many Latin American economies suffered through devastating debt crises in the early 1980s, triggered by high interest rates and a deep recession. However, the country originating these prescriptions for financial and economic soundness, the United States, did not appear to follow them. They didn't follow them. With growing budget deficits and a consistently negative balance of trade in the 1980s and the 1990s, the United States began borrowing from international capital markets on a massive scale. So you can see how this obviously benefits the banking interests that I was discussing last week. It remains very controversial whether Washington consensus policies provided any advantage to developing countries in many instances. This could be described as an understatement. I assure you the Washington consensus benefited very few developing countries, if any at all. But I mean, you could get into a deeper discussion of this, you could look up the information regarding to this, but there are many articles that discuss how the Washington consensus was a completely disastrous policy for the quote-unquote developing world. And although most financial economists maintain that the benefits of globalised financial markets have largely outweighed the costs, I would obviously strongly disagree with that. This issue also remains contentious. And here's an important issue that I just want to discuss briefly. When financial markets are global and capital controls are weak, the result can be increased financial instability. For one, it is easier for crises to be sparked and then spread across borders where there are no controls in place. A prominent case in point is the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. Earlier in the decade, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines dropped their capital controls in an attempt to attract FDI, that's foreign direct investment. It just means overseas investment, foreign industry essentially, and capital. They were successful in drawing international capital and a bubble ensued. In July 1997, foreign investors began to withdraw funds in local currencies for dollars. The panic quickly spread and local currencies crashed, leading to severe recessions. Moreover, it is clear that international financial integration also contributed to the recent global financial crisis. Obviously, when you're hearing what happened there in Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, it's an absolute carbon copy of what's been occurring in Europe recently. I'll go back to discussing that Asian economic crisis in a second, but I just want to read this final paragraph. In the United States, the financial sector's share of the total economy has steadily grown since the Second World War, more than trebling in that time. As I said last week, it's conservatively 31% of the US economy. I'm just going to briefly discuss at this point a point as well relates to the British economy, seeing as we're talking about the growth of the financial sector. There's an article here from the Daily Telegraph in January 2012. It's headline, Nicolas Sarkozy said Britain has no industry. Wouldn't in any way say that Sarkozy is anything other than a completely untrustworthy individual. But in response to these claims, it's here in the Daily Telegraph, a UK official said, it is not true. The percentage of GDP that is manufacturing is 11%. Manufacturing as a percentage of GDP was 11% in the UK in 2009. So the reason I wanted to discuss this briefly was that, firstly, as I was saying last week, the percentage of the financial sector, the percentage of the GDP that is attributed to the financial sector and financial services industry is conservatively 15%. So you can already see that it's outweighed manufacturing. And secondly, that was the British government and the British establishment essentially defending the amount of manufacturing that's in the culture and in the economy by saying that it's 11%. So it's 11% of economic activity. It says 89% of economic activity is just financial transactions, service sector, etc. Now, in the way that the economy is developed and in the way the economic system is developed, it's not unreasonable to expect a certain amount of service sector to exist. And as long as you're going to have a unit of exchange and call it money, then it's not unreasonable for people to exchange money for services. Generally, we tend to think that money should be exchanged for goods and services, but we now know that 90% of the British economy is nothing to do with goods, it's nothing to do with the manufacturing of goods, nothing to do with actually producing things. It's to do with either swapping things around or making financial transactions or saying, oh, I'll do this for you and you can pay me that, and so on and so forth. That in itself isn't a bad thing, because you could argue that's selling your labour for a reasonable level of currency. But nevertheless, in all the financial activity that takes place in Britain, only 1/10 of it is actually people making things, which is, when you think about what the purpose of finance is supposed to be, and what the purpose of the economy is supposed to be, and what the purpose of work is supposed to be. You know, at one time you had massive shipyards all over the place, you had coal mines all over the place. You know, I come from a place where the fishing industry was massive. That's completely dead now in Britain. So, and you know, there are many other productive and manufacturing industries, textiles, etc. To give one obvious example from Lancashire, that would all have greatly contributed to the economy in the past. And this is primarily what work should be associated with. I mean, of course, ideally, you want the workers to own the means of production in a cooperative fashion. You don't just want them to be working for corporations or companies to produce things and a small surfeit of people taking all the profits while the workers are paid a pretty trivial wage in order to make these products. That is the capitalist model, and you know, I would strongly argue the cooperative model is far superior to that in terms of the effects that it has on the general public and the opportunities that it gives for people to attain a decent standard of living in a position of self-determinism. However, even within a capitalist model, even within the model that's become dominant, particularly in the 20th and 21st century, it's obviously better for a nation to be producing its own products than it is for them to be importing their products, or for them to be reliant on service sector and financial concerns to generate their GDP and generate their economy. So, if we think about, and this is something this is never presented to you by the mainstream media. It's never discussed in the mainstream media. It's sure as hell never discussed by television at any stage. You never see this on the BBC News or ITM, and it's something that most people have failed to consider. And you know, it's very much something that a belief and an understanding that they're steered away from. And that is that the whole point of going to work is you exchange your labour for something of value. That's the whole point. The whole point of the labour market is you go to someone, an employer needs something, another person needs something, so you go to them and say, I will provide what you need, and in order for me to provide that, you will provide me what I require to live, prosper, and so forth. That is the whole basis of labour. That is what it's supposed to be. It would be sensible, and there would be a sensible economic model if people were doing this in order to produce products which were then useful to people. Of course, that isn't happening at all. We know this for a fact. Even the most optimistic defenders of this system and defenders of their own legacy, the British government, are stating that that's only 10% of everything of all the economic activity that takes place. 9/10 the economic activity that takes place, you can basically do without it. It's basically useless. Obviously you could pick some service sector employment and some service sector products that are produced and services that are given to people and garnered by the general public that are more useful than others. There's no doubt about that. But the primary focus of economic activity should be on producing things. Otherwise, what would happen if you reached a point where 0% of the country's economy was manufacturing things? It means you'd have to import everything. And once you have to import everything, then you rely on the currency retaining its trading value. If the currency doesn't retain its trading value, then you can't import anything. If you can't import anything, people can't get what they need to survive. If people can't get what they need to survive, they're not going to turn up to work anymore. If they're not going to turn up to work anymore, there isn't going to be any economic activity. If there isn't any economic activity, your currency is going to become less valuable, and so forth. So, although this wasn't in any way explained, in my opinion, correctly by the Daily Telegraph, and it wasn't in any way conveyed in a meaningful way, this is quite a telling statistic that actually appears in this article that gives some extent to which this crony capitalist industrialised society that doesn't actually produce anything has become cemented in our culture. So just reading out the last bit of the article. In the 1980s, the beginning of a boom period in complex corporate financing and the proliferation of new financial products ensued. Financial deregulation and the newly globalised capital markets brought fresh opportunities, and highly skilled individuals were most able to take advantage of them. Financial sector compensation rose, particularly among professionals working in investment banks and hedge funds. Since the 1970s, tremendous financial sector growth also occurred in other major advanced nations such as the United Kingdom, France and Germany. Many analysts believe that the financial sector of the industrialised world now holds excessive economic and political power, as it has simply grown too large. In my view, that is incontestably the case. The challenge today is to craft new rules and regulation that will keep the financial sector functioning without crisis in the years to come. The expectation is that new regulatory frameworks will stabilise capital allocation, prevent excessive risk-taking, as well as financial concentration. That's a very noble belief that this person writing the article has written, and I would love to see that happen, but he says here the challenge today is to craft new rules and regulation that will keep the financial sector functioning. There's been no evidence of this. There's been no inclination towards this. The financial sector has been deregulated over this period, and there's been these huge scandals that weren't really put in the proper context, although they were discussed in the British media. The LIBOR rigging scandal should have been the biggest story in the history of Britain, arguably. This was an incredible manipulation, an absolute conspiracy by the Bank of England and various people, including Barclays and HSBC, to rig the markets in their favour. It's absolutely the rigging of markets, and perhaps in a future programme I'll get into that in more depth. But they suffered no penalty for that. They really, considering the billions and billions and billions of dollars, and considering the huge knock-on effect that had, and considering how morally repugnant it was for them to do this, and considering that if you or I attempted some form of criminality of a similar nature on a infinitely smaller scale, we'd be in prison like that. It would be a court would throw the key away on you if you stole a few million, like the guy who crashed Bearing's bank, whose name escapes me. This is entirely trivial compared to fixing the LIBOR rate. Yet, have Barclays or HSBC experienced any punitive conditions? They were fined a small amount of money, and then everything just continued as it was before. That's like me going to court, being caught burgling a house or something, or being caught with stolen goods, and the court saying to me, "Oh, catching me bang to rights," and giving the verdict, and the judge saying to me, "Okay, how much stuff did you steal?" Well, I stole about 50 grand's worth of stuff. Okay, you can pay a fine for £5,000. We won't make you give any of the stuff back, and you can continue burgling houses in the future. Are you happy with that verdict? Yeah, I'm quite happy with that verdict. That's essentially what happened. The amount of money that Barclays and HSBC have been asked to pay as a fine, entirely trivial compared to what they stole. And there was no other punitive measures taken against them whatsoever. They weren't punished in any way. There was no regulation of those markets. Nothing changed. They weren't told that they had to change their conduct in the future. None of their operations were closed down. No one was sent to prison. Nothing of any consequence happened in response to what is one of the biggest scandals that you will ever hear of anywhere under any circumstances. So, when this guy's saying that new rules and regulations will keep the financial sector functioning without crisis, I don't feel as convinced as he is of that particular factor. So to come back to discussing the Asian financial crisis, there's a document I've got here which just goes over some of the factors which contributed to this crisis. And again, these will be very familiar to anyone that's been paying attention to what's been going on in Europe. The first factor was excessive lending by banks. According to figures, there was a lending boom in Asia. The growth of private sector lending was smallest at 7% in China and highest at 151% in the Philippines, 58% in Thailand and 31% in Malaysia between 1990 and 1996. This can be compared to Mexico, where private sector lending grew 116% from 1990 to 94, Argentina's 57% and Brazil's 68%. Brazil had a huge financial crisis at this time. Excuse me. And Argentina they had huge problems with the IMF in the early parts of the 21st century. I'd like to discuss that in a separate program at some point, but if you go into YouTube and type Argentina financial crisis or Argentina and the IMF, you can see some of the things that occurred at that time. Absolutely incredible scenes with huge amounts of rioting and looting, and the police and military on the streets firing tear gas at them. And one of the primary reasons for this was that the IMF imposed austerity measures on Argentina, and they froze everyone's bank account in the country, apart from a very small number of privileged people. And that's why people were on the streets looting things and smashing banks up and so on and so forth. The fact that there was a lot of lending need not be bad for the Asian economies if they perform well. However, a high proportion of them were non-performing loans. Just before the crisis came about, non-performing loans as a proportion of total loans is estimated at 14% in the Philippines. It is really a wonder why banks were willing to continue lending out so much, although they were already laden with so many non-performing loans. Cronyism comes to mind. Most of the loans were made to finance dubious investments or speculation of assets, especially property. The second reason was huge foreign debt in Asian economies. Since the 1980s and until the crisis, Asian economies have been growing rapidly. The Asian miracle relied on high investment rates. The Asian economy borrowed a lot of money, usually in foreign currencies, which have lowered interest rates. Which have lower interest rates. Their economies had to depend on borrowing to finance their investments. Their foreign debt, therefore, grew to a huge liability. As long as they could keep borrowing, they could keep their economy growing. However, they cannot keep borrowing forever. When they could no longer borrow more money, they were unable to finance their debts. Some corporations went bust, while others incurred huge losses. This should be a lesson to us in Britain. It should be a lesson to people in Europe, although people in Europe seem to be very much more aware of what's going on than people in Britain. And it should be a lesson to people in the United States. When they could no longer borrow more money, they were unable to finance their debts. Is that, that would seem to be fairly logical. That would seem to be fairly straightforward to me, but I hear economics being discussed on TV and no one ever seems to put that point forward. It seems to be like some sort of surreal or parallel universe in which people seem to have lost leave of their senses and seem to fail to comprehend the most basic economic issues and economic principles. continuing reading from this, they have also come to be dependent on high growth rates. What do we hear on TV all the time? What do we hear David Cameron crapping on about all the time? Oh, we've created growth. We need more growth. What can we do to create more growth? They come to be dependent on high growth rates. The reason they become dependent on high growth rates is because they need growth to grow their economy, to pay back the money they're lending, that they're borrowing. But when they could no longer borrow more money, they were unable to finance these debts. That's what's happening now in Europe. It's what's happening now in Britain. It's what's happening now in the United States. It's being caused by this crony capitalist banking system that I was discussing last week. It's exactly the same thing that's happening in Asia. It's exactly the same thing that's happening in Latin America. It's exactly the same thing that's happening in Africa. And it's happening again now in the quote-unquote developed world. We thought we were so advanced because you could buy microwaves here. But as it turns out, we're no different from the rest of the crony capitalist globalised system. It was the high growth rates that brought in their investments and made profits for their corporations and enhanced their ability to repay foreign debt. As long as the economy was growing, they would have a higher ability to pay their debts. However, this crisis made things worse than it already was, making the financing of debt difficult. The next factor was high growth and inflation. Due to the high growth rates in Asia in the years before the crisis, it brought about a high level of confidence, and its people started spending more on optimism that their wages will rise further. This is the classic bubble that we hear people, or is sometimes referred to as an economic cycle, or it's regarded to as the boom and bust theory, or any number of other things. They're all complete crap, it's all complete nonsense. It's really driven by it's driven by what was being discussed earlier, which is capital flows, and that's just driven by debt, just driven by the creation of money in this farcical way that it's created, and the fact that most of the money that's circulating in society is completely arbitrary. It's not driven by an economic cycle. It's not driven by optimism or confidence in the market, although that can have a certain amount of effect on it. It's almost entirely driven by the amount of money that's in circulation. However, the US dollar continued to show strength from 1995 all the way up to the crisis and beyond. As currencies in Asia were mostly fixed or semi-fixed, Asian currencies followed and became grossly overvalued. The overvalued currencies made Asian exports less competitive. Since many Asian economies were completely export-driven, they suffered when export growth fell, sometimes to negative territory. And then finally, I'm just going to read this section that states that it's called How the Factors Brought About the Crisis. In 1995, the US dollar strengthened substantially. Since most Asian currencies were pegged to the dollar, which is now not securitized by anything, the competitiveness of Asian exports went down. This reduced their profitability, and their economies had less foreign currency receipts to pay off their debt. As the dollar continued to show strength, it became apparent that it was no longer feasible to remain on a peg to the dollar. As the pegs began to loosen, their currencies began to slide. This caused many corporations a huge liability, as they would have to pay back their foreign debt with more of their local currency. This is hyperinflation, essentially. If you ever see pictures of Zimbabwe, if you ever type in Zimbabwe dollar into Google and just go to the images section, you'll see people with massive stacks of money, like 20 billion Zimbabwean dollars to buy eggs and to buy bread, because the currency became completely devalued by this precise process. That's the most stark example of it, but it's happened all over the world. It's happened in many other countries as well. This caused many bankruptcies. That would be the natural reaction, wouldn't it? Together with the earlier loss of profitability in Asian nations, this led to a fall in credit growth as banks and other financial institutions became more cautious and cut lending. This meant that Asian economies cannot sustain their rate of investment, and since Asian nations' economies depended on it, it brought about many corporate bankruptcies and many other businesses' investments made a loss. And what happens after this happens? What happens after corporations go bankrupt? What happens after local businesses' investments make a loss and go out of business? In-pile the multinational corporations, in-pile the international banks, and they just take over the society and culture. This is exactly what's happening in Europe now. I mean, I'm sure what I've just read to you is hugely familiar to anyone that's been following the European quote-unquote crisis. It's not a crisis, it's just a systematic and systemic result of the type of economic system and society that's been created in the post-Second World War period. So, before I finish this section, I just want to discuss two things briefly. I appreciate this hasn't been as brief as I intended. The one word that continually comes up in the article that I was reading to you, the academic report, I should say, was hyperglobalization. Hyperglobalization refers to the rapid extent and expansion of globalization, of the kind of culture and society and economic interdependency that I was discussing last week. I've got an article here which is written by a guy called Dr. Norman Becker. It's called Hyperglobalization, the Nation State, and it discusses a book called A Globalization Paradox. So I just want to read from this article briefly. Danny Roderick's recent book on the globalization paradox is reviewed here in The American Prospect. The basic idea in his book is that markets need states to operate effectively, but the advancement of globalization weakens the nation state. Hyperglobalization weakens the markets they cherish, as well as the state's capacity to reflect the wishes of its citizens. Roderick argues that the post-war Bretton Woods era was the ideal middle ground of moderate globalization. There were moderate tariffs and tight regulation of global capital movements and speculations on currencies. Remember when I was discussing last week the extent to which tariffs and regulations were broken down during this period, the immediate post-Second World War period in particular, and then the gold standard was removed completely. After the collapse of Bretton Woods, we moved towards hyperglobalization. Global businesses could escape regulation at home, and economists supported the movement by arguing that an institutional underpinning would catch up and that it would have no effect on the domestic institutional arrangements. Hyperglobalization may have resulted in greater efficiencies, but at the cost of increased instability. In particular, global finance outran domestic institutional arrangements, and international arrangements are weak and ineffective. The scope of workable globalization limits the scope of desirable globalization. I mean, it's highly debatable whether globalization is desirable. I think that, as I was saying last week, there is some argument in favour of international trade. I wouldn't necessarily say international trade is a bad thing, but I am completely against any form of globalisation. I favour self-sufficiency. It's desirable to have effective markets, democracy and competent nation states. With hyperglobalisation, we can have only two of these at best. So I could spend some time discussing the concepts here contained within. I hope you can see how that last paragraph I just read particularly relates to what I was discussing last week. But what the danger of what is ultimately being discussed here was summed up by Thomas Jefferson. I just want to read the quotation from Thomas Jefferson here. The end of democracy and the defeat of the American Revolution will occur when government falls into the hands of lending institutions and moneyed-in corporations. The country is headed towards a single and splendid government of an aristocracy founded on banking institution and moneyed-in corporations, and if this tendency continues, it will be the end of freedom and democracy. The few will be ruling. I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to trial and bid defiance to the laws of our country. I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies. And of course, I think it can be strongly argued, and I would strongly advocate the fact that it is this global banking system that has caused more suffering, more death, more hardship than anything else, including standing armies. Of course, over time, as I was discussing last week, standing armies and the foreign policy and military interests of particularly the Anglo-American and EU NATO world have become completely dominated by these financial interests, so that standing armies are merely an expression of what Jefferson was talking about. So the quotation has lost some of its relevance in that respect, but it remains hugely relevant in terms of banking establishments being more dangerous than anything else. Accordingly, because Jefferson felt this way, he favoured an economy of independent, small-scale farmers. Of course, we've moved so far away from that with the industrialisation of food production and the power of corporations like Monsanto. But I think, you see people today that are realising that we need to go back to some sort of localised production, and it needs to be sustainable. It needs to be based on local people purchasing goods and producing it themselves, and so on and so forth. So, I think Jefferson's arguments stand up very well today. So that's just a footnote to last week's, quite a long footnote as it turns out, but it was supposed to be a footnote to last week's programme, just discussing some of the issues further. In the second half of the programme today, I'm going to be discussing China and the BRIC nations. BRIC refers to Brazil, Russia, India and China, and sometimes referred to now as BRICs because South Africa has also become part of this group. And the group's also seeking allegiances with other countries all over the world. I mentioned Venezuela last week. but it's primarily referred to as BRIC or BRICs. And this is just a new economic power bloc in the world. It's a group of countries that's come together to cooperate in very much the same way that European Union nations have been doing so in the past. So I'm going to discuss the BRIC nations in the second half of this programme, particularly China, and explain the relevance that this has to the present political and economic paradigm in the Western world, and some of the issues and some of the ways that this relationship will unfold in the future. But I'm just going to have a break before I do that, so I'll just play a song quickly and then I'll be back in a few minutes. Okay, last week I discussed the Anglo-American establishment and their dominant role in the world and their primary role in crafting and dominating this globalised economic system, this interdependent culture. I'd like to discuss today the importance of a group of countries that are now commonly referred to as the BRIC nations. BRIC simply an acronym meaning Brazil, Russia, India and China, sometimes called BRICs, and it incorporates South Africa, but the primary players in this group are Brazil, India and more significantly Russia and China. This acronym was originally coined by someone who worked for Goldman Sachs called Jim O'Neill, who wrote a paper in 2001 that was entitled Building Better Global Economic BRICs. That's the first time the acronym had been used. It's now, although it's not something that you hear of being used very frequently in the mainstream media in Britain, it has come into widespread use, and the countries themselves call themselves the BRIC nations, and they meet annually at a conference they call the BRICs conference. They called it the BRIC conference until I think it was 2011 when South Africa joined the conference for the first time. But the four political leaders of Brazil, Russia, India and China have been meeting for a few years now. In this particular paper, Jim O'Neill predicted that the BRIC economies would overtake the G7 economies by 2027. This has turned out to be a very conservative estimate. That is certainly going to be inaccurate because the Chinese economy is already the second largest in the world, and it's predicted to overtake the US economy in the next 3 to 4 years. There are other important economic indicators with regards to China and its position of preeminence and predominance that it's going to take, but I will discuss those in due course, because before I begin my discussion of this subject, I just want to proceed it by playing a clip which is a segment of a speech that Barack Obama gave when he spoke before the British Parliament at Westminster Hall, London, on the 25th of May 2011. So I'm just going to play this clip and then I'll discuss why this is important and what the significance of it is.
Together, we have met great challenges. But as we enter this new chapter in our shared history, profound challenges stretch out before us. In a world where the prosperity of all nations is now inextricably linked, a new era of cooperation is required to ensure the growth and stability of the global economy. As new threats spread across borders and oceans, we must dismantle terrorist networks and stop the spread of nuclear weapons, confront climate change, and combat famine and disease. And as a revolution races through the streets of the Middle East and North Africa, the entire world has a stake in the aspirations of a generation that longs to determine its own destiny. These challenges come at a time when the international order has already been reshaped for a new century. Countries like China, India, and Brazil are growing by leaps and bounds. We should welcome this development, for it has lifted hundreds of millions from poverty around the globe and created new markets and opportunities for our own nations. And yet, as this rapid change has taken place, it's become fashionable in some quarters to question whether the rise of these nations will accompany the decline of American and European influence around the world. Perhaps, the argument goes, these nations represent the future, and the time for our leadership has passed. That argument is wrong. The time for our leadership is now. It was the United States and the United Kingdom and our democratic allies that shaped a world in which new nations could emerge and individuals could thrive. And even as more nations take on the responsibilities of global leadership, our alliance will remain indispensable to the goal of a century that is more peaceful, more prosperous, and more just. At a time when threats and challenges require nations to work in concert with one another, we remain the greatest catalysts for global action.
Okay, so that was the usual combination of deeply disingenuous statements, spin, and complete horseshit. But obviously the key section I wanted to talk about was where Obama was talking about some people have claimed that Brazil, India and China will become people that essentially lead the world order, but this argument is wrong. Now, it's a very rare occasion that an American president comes to speak at Westminster, and when they do, they obviously talk about something of particular significance. They're not just going to stand there and talk about the kinds of trivial issues that come up during the American presidential campaign. You know, it's very rare that a president is actually invited to speak at Westminster. I'm not sure who the previous president to speak before Obama was, but Reagan spoke at Westminster on the 8th of June 1982, and he said the following: "This is precisely our mission today, to preserve freedom as well as peace. It may not be easy to see, but I believe we live now at a turning point." It's a key phrase there, that it's a turning point. In an ironic sense, Karl Marx was right. We are witnessing today a great revolutionary crisis, a crisis where the demands of the economic order are conflicting directly with those of the political order. But the crisis is happening not in the free, non-Marxist West, but in the home of Marxist-Leninism, the Soviet Union. It is a Soviet Union that runs against the tide of history by denying human freedom and human dignity to its citizens. It is also in deep economic difficulty. So Reagan obviously chose this occasion to speak about the Cold War and about what he's deemed to be the demise of the Soviet Union and the demise of communism or Marxism at the hands of what he described as the free world. And similarly, this dealing with very theatre-wide, epoch-changing events, and similarly Obama is doing the same thing. Now, Obama is many things, but he's not an idiot, so he will obviously be aware of all the economic predictions that China is going to overtake the United States. He'll probably be aware of the Goldman Sachs paper that I referred to previously. He will know this is an inevitability. He's not, and every major political figure in Britain and America will know this inevitability. I'm sure there are many backbench MPs and many low-ranking congressmen and senators and so forth that have got no idea what's going on, because they see things in very blinkered macroeconomic terms. But the combination of these nations together, particularly the rise of China, is going to put them in a position where they are the primary force that shapes the world stage, you could describe it as. And I'm going to explain why, and I'm going to explain the significance of this, and I'm going to explain how it impacts upon some things that we're seeing occur on the world stage at the moment. So the BRIC nations, who actually refer to themselves as the BRIC nations even though they didn't coin the term themselves, first met on the 16th of June 2009 in a place called Yekaterinburg. I'm almost certain that's not how you pronounce it, but it's a place in Russia. And what happens is the leaders of the nations at any given time get together, and this is referred to as the BRIC summit. And in advance of this first summit in 2009, they made the following statement: "We, the leaders of the Federative Republic of Brazil, the Russian Federation, the Republic of India, and the People's Republic of China, have discussed the current situation in the global economy and other pressing issues of global development, and also prospects for further strengthening collaboration within the BRIC at our meetings in Yekaterinburg on the 16th of June 2009. Why they couldn't have met in Moscow, I have no idea. But they had to meet in Yekaterinburg. So you can see from that paragraph that it's very much the same sort of rhetoric that we've got used to hearing from the Anglo-American establishment. And once they'd had their summit or conference or whatever you wish to call it, they release a statement in advance of the conference, and they release a statement after the conference is over. So I just wanted to read some of the statements they made after the first conference, just to further confirm that it's, people can get very muddled and think, oh, they're fighting the New World Order, these people, the Russians and the Chinese, they're fighting the New World Order because they're fighting the Anglo-American establishment. And they're against Obama and the US presidency and the White House, and they're against the US going into Syria, and they're against NATO going into Syria, and they're saying a few things that we could find some agreement with, but that would be a very misguided approach. So I just want to read these statements so that you can see that you're dealing with exactly the same mindset that is, and I'm sure people would understandably and rightly argue it's exactly the same forces at play, really. So this is the statement they made after the conference was over. We stressed the central role played by the G20 summits in dealing with the financial crisis. They have fostered cooperation, policy coordination and political dialogue regarding international economic and financial matters. We call upon all states and relevant international bodies to act vigorously to implement the decisions adopted at the G20 summit in London on the 2nd of April 2009. We shall cooperate closely among ourselves and with other partners to ensure further progress of collective action at the next G20 summit to be held in Pittsburgh in September 2009. We look forward to a successful outcome of the United Nations Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development, which is to be held in New York on June the 24th to 26th, 2009. We recognise the important role played by international trade and foreign direct investments in the world economic recovery. We call upon all parties to work together to improve the international trade and investment environment. We urge the international community to keep the multilateral trading system stable, curb trade protectionism, and push for comprehensive and balanced results of the World Trade Organization's Doha Development Agenda. We are committed to advancing the reform of international financial institutions so as to reflect changes in the global economy. The emerging and developing economies must have greater voice and representation in international financial institutions. We've agreed upon steps to promote dialogue and cooperation among our countries in an incremental, proactive, pragmatic, open and transparent way. The implementation of the concept of sustainable development, comprising inter alia the Rio Declaration, Agenda for the 21st Century and multilateral environmental agreements, should be a major vector in the change of paradigm of economic development. Just explain briefly that is the Rio Declaration that was made at the Rio Summit in 1992, which is considered to be a very significant thing. Agenda for the 21st Century is Agenda 21. So, they obviously believe those two things should be taken on. We support international cooperation in the field of energy efficiency. We stand ready for a constructive dialogue on how to deal with climate change based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, given the need to combine measures to protect the climate with steps to fulfil our socio-economic development tasks. I'd like to do a programme about climate change. Well, I'll be doing a few probably in the future when I get round to it. There's probably some more important issues that I'd like to discuss first, but not that I'd like to denigrate the idea of climate change not being an important issue, because it's probably one of the most important issues we're facing, but I will certainly be discussing that more in the future. We take note of the statement on global food security issued today as a major contribution of the BRIC countries to the multilateral efforts to set up the sustainable conditions for this goal. We underline our support for a more democratic and just multipolar world order based on the rule of international law, equality, mutual respect, cooperation, coordinated action and collective decision-making of all states. We express our strong commitment to multilateral diplomacy, with the United Nations playing the central role in dealing with the global challenges and threats. In this respect, we reaffirm the need for a comprehensive reform of the UN with a view to making it more efficient so that it can deal with today's global challenges more effectively. We reiterate the importance we attach to the status of India and Brazil international affairs and understand and support their aspirations to play a greater role in the United Nations. So to summarise these statements, this is not a grouping that wishes to challenge the existing order of multilateral trade agreements, open borders, decimation of economic protectionism, powerful international financial and corporate institutions running everything, the agenda related to climate change, and of course they explicitly state this themselves. Their statements are really intended to indicate that they intend to lead this order. At the time, the Times described the first BRICS summit in the following way. A new political bloc was formed yesterday to challenge the global dominance of the United States. The first summit of heads of state of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India and China, ended with a declaration calling for a multipolar world order, diplomatic code for a rejection of America's position as the sole global superpower. President Medvedev of Russia went further in a statement with his fellow leaders after the summit, saying that the BRIC countries wanted to create the conditions for a fairer world order. He described the meeting with President Lula da Silva of Brazil, the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and the Chinese President Hu Jintao as an historic event. So that was just the very first BRICS summit. They've taken place annually since then. And if you look at these statements that have come out of them and that have been released in advance of them, if you Google BRICS summit or BRICS statement or BRIC meeting, or any of these type of things, they'll come up. Some of them are actually contained on the Council on Foreign Relations website. But you'll see that later conferences have completely shared these aims and completely shared this agenda. It's all globalised issues. It's all the things that we've come to hear from Obama and Cameron and Bush and whoever else is the political leader at the time. It's the exact same agenda. If anything, the later meetings have become more and more in line with this agenda and more in line with the kind of issues that we've heard Obama and so forth talking about, that the Anglo-American establishment have been trying to advance as well. And there are two real reasons for this. The first reason is because the same people are essentially behind the scenes, the same corporate banking, military-industrial structure that is really pulling the strings and has great power now in many nations, including China. Even a country the size of China will struggle to stand up to these interests when they work together cooperatively. And the second reason is because they know it works. China is a completely autocratic, totalitarian state. They know all about power. They know all about how to impose power over people, and they know all about how to make people not only accept power, but to go along with it and to favour it and to think that it's in their interest. So when they see, regardless of what role they're meant to play in this banking plutocracy, when they see techniques that work, when they see arguments that work, when they see propaganda that works, they recognise it straight away because that's what they're in the business of doing. So when they recognise it, they're perfectly happy to adopt it because ultimately, China is really on a massive level. It's kind of a microcosm of a managed society. It's a society in which nothing is allowed to get in and nothing is allowed to get out. No information is allowed to get into the society, and nothing is allowed to come out of the society that they don't want to happen. This was something that was discussed in the novel Jurassic Park. It was stated in that novel that what they were trying to do is create a microclimate within an island and then manage that microclimate, and that was essentially impossible. But this is what China are doing. Okay, they're not managing the actual climate, but it's to create a completely self-contained state in which not only is it self-contained in terms of propaganda, but it's self-contained in terms of self-sufficiency. It's self-contained in terms of people don't want to look beyond China for anything. They don't want to look beyond China culturally. They don't want to look beyond China in terms of information. Everything they have is contained within that, albeit very, very large microclimate of, I think the population of China is 1.3 billion people. So if you watch something like Russia Today, for example, you will notice that they never have anything negative to say about China, or very little negative to say about China, certainly in comparison to the United States. In fact, they have actively promoted the idea that this power bloc, the BRIC nations, will become the main seat of power in the world. And they reported on a conference which took place in April 2011, which has been dubbed to a certain extent Bretton Woods 2. You may remember earlier today and last week we were talking about Bretton Woods, which took place in 1944. So I'm just going to read from the RT report on the Bretton Woods II conference. This conference, incidentally, was hosted by George Soros, who I mentioned previously, and it comprised a group of high-ranking policymakers and economists, and the subject of it was an acknowledgement that the economic dominance of Europe and America is coming to an end, with developing economies increasingly taking their place. Russia Today reported that the participants were trying to navigate new terrain completely different than it was decades ago during the 1940s, when the original institutions that came out of the original Bretton Woods conference came to be, which are still in place today. Things like the IMF, things like the US reserve currency as the dollar. There is a need to dramatically change economic thinking in the wake of a crisis, in the wake of a situation where for a lot of the people here that are focused on the problems in Western countries of the US and Europe, the key question is, in an era where now they are no longer dominant, they're being outproduced, out-exported, out-invested by the rest of the world, what is that going to look like with the rise of BRIC nations, the emerging markets which are now driving growth, and which, as former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown said yesterday when he addressed the group, are now probably going to be the key to the rebalancing of the global economy. And there needs to be a much greater role for the BRIC nations in global governing economic bodies such as the IMF, such as these organisations that were set up decades ago, which are now outdated in the wake of what is now a completely changed terrain in the global economy. This was an item that was broadcast on RT, and it was titled "Financial Heavy Hitters Weigh BRIC Role in New World Economic Order." Now, there are several reasons why the economic power is shifting, and these should be very familiar themes when I discuss them. And the first one is debt. Both the United States and Britain, not to mention virtually every other European nation, if you Google world debt clocks, it should come up as the very first link that you Google. If you look at that, you can see that every single European nation is in massive amounts of debt. I mean, there's been a lot of focus on the United States because it takes this primary role in the world, but there are many European nations that are in a much worse financial position than the United States. Obviously, the United States is broke, but it's no better for any. You couldn't put your finger on a European nation, with the exception of Switzerland, that was in a better position. So all the financial sector corruption, all the excessive borrowing, the perpetual war for perpetual peace, as Gore Vidal put it, has led to a situation where every government has huge amounts of external debt. By contrast, the economies of Brazil, Russia, India and China have a relatively paltry amount of debt. And coupled with this, particularly in the case of India and China, they have rapid economic growth, which puts them in a considerably stronger financial position than the bankrupt Anglo-American EU NATO system. So the United States external debt is actually 3 times greater than Russia in percentage terms relative to their GDPs, over 5 times greater than Brazil, and nearly 20 times greater than China. The United States is the greatest debtor nation in the history of the world. However, the British economy can only dream of being in such a strong position as the US. Britain is 11 times more indebted than Russia, approximately 20 times more indebted than India and Brazil, and over 75 times more indebted than China. I mean, 75 times is quite a lot. I'm sure you'll agree. Particularly when China is an absolutely huge economy. China's a much bigger economy than Britain. And Britain still remains a pretty big economy. I think it's either the 6th or 7th biggest economy in the world. But nonetheless, we don't really want to be in a position of being 75 times more in debt than China. Today, Brazil's external debt is approximately $268 billion, US dollars, which pales next to the US debt of nearly getting on now for 17 trillion. It's about 16.5 trillion, I think. And the UK debt, it's very difficult to measure the UK debt because they've put virtually everything off the balance sheet. But there was an article in the Daily Telegraph that came out years ago now saying that we have unpaid liabilities that we can't possibly cover that were equal to £4.9 trillion. Now that's out of date, so it'll be well over 5 trillion by now. If you were able to do a full accounting of the debt, then I would suggest it would far outstrip 5 trillion. You'd probably be looking at a lot more than that. But we know conservatively it's at least £5 trillion, as opposed, so in dollars that'd be $8 trillion, as opposed to 268 billion. Obviously, $268 billion sounds like a lot, but it's approximately 3% of $8 trillion. Running concurrently to this, Brazil's GDP grew at double the rate of both the United States and Britain between 1983 and the present day. While witnessing the Argentinian riots, the Brazilian political establishment would probably reflect the fact that when they were in difficult financial position in the 1980s, instead of enlisting the help of the International Monetary Fund, they kicked them out of the country and they forged a plan that enables and allowed Brazil to remain relatively independent of borrowing from international banks. There's been a great deal of corruption in Brazil. I wouldn't say it's a perfect country by any stretch of the imagination, but kicking the IMF out is never a bad idea. So when the former president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, met his Portuguese counterpart, José Sócrates Carvalho Pinto de Sousa, during a visit to Portugal, he stated to the Portuguese president, whenever the IMF tried to take care of countries' debts, it created more problems than solutions. I assure you the IMF won't resolve Portugal's problems. So that's the first issue. The second issue is oil. Russia is the world's biggest oil producer, with production levels approximately 15% greater than the next biggest producer, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, has a very favourable relationship with the United States, whereby the United States blocked investigations into supposedly Saudi Arabian hijackers that were involved in 9/11. Russia produces 10.5 million barrels of oil per day. In fact, it's frequently noted in the mainstream press that European nations are hugely dependent on Russian exports of crude oil. In August 2008, the Daily Telegraph reported on fears that Russia could restrict oil flow to Western Europe in response to the threat of EU sanctions and NATO naval actions in the Black Sea. There's a book called Putin, the Rise of Russia, and in that book, Michael Sturmer, who wrote the book, makes the following statement. The legal basis for EU-Russian relations is the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement signed in 1994, which came into force in 1997. The Russians today claim that it reflects a time of Russian weakness, and that is why they are pressing for a thorough revision. A new agreement is being negotiated which would take into account Russia's new assertiveness. Energy has become the defining element in the European Union and in its relations with Russia. It is the paramount concern on both sides, but for different reasons. For any foreseeable future, Europeans will need Russian energy. Brazil, meanwhile, is in a very strong position, being the 9th biggest oil producer in the world, with Petrobras, the Brazilian state oil company, having discovered huge natural gas and petroleum reserves off the southeast coast of the country. They produce over 2.5 million barrels per day of oil, which is greater than all the European Union countries combined. So you can imagine how much more Russia is producing than all the European Unions combined. Furthermore, due to the discovery of this untapped oil field, Brazil is now estimated to have natural oil and gas reserves that would place it among the top 5 nations in the world. And of course, if you look at other untapped resources of oil, such as Iran, or I should say that it's not so much untapped as that it hasn't been brought under the control of Western corporations yet. Obviously, a US-led NATO military invasion of Brazil is not particularly likely. It's simply unfeasible. There's no way you could sell it to the people. You might be able to sell an Iran invasion, but if they said, oh, we're piling into Brazil, I think you'll find that's not really going to happen. Furthermore, Brazil has made significant investment in hydroelectric power and ethanol. This is used frequently in fuel in Brazilian cars. 90% of new cars on the road can run off ethanol, which is made from Brazilian sugarcane. Similarly, in the United States, this is purely because they produce a surplus of corn. They've been making a lot of biofuels out of corn. That's really driven by the fact that they make a massive surplus of corn. But Brazil actually planned to reduce their reliance on oil. Despite the fact the United States makes loads of biofuels out of corn, their reliance on oil has not even slightly reduced. But Brazil made a very clear plan to have less reliance on oil, despite the fact they produce massive amounts of it. And now 90% of their new cars on the road in Brazil run on biofuels, or on this ethanol that's made out of sugar. If you actually look up, there's an image on Wikipedia of a Brazilian petrol pump, and you'll see there's 2 pumps, there's one for oil, there's one for ethanol. I don't know if this will ever happen in Britain, or, I mean, obviously eventually you'll have to, because there will, sooner or later there'll be no oil, or we won't be able to import oil in the right amount of amounts, or it'll become economically viable to switch to biofuels. So presumably one day we will see something similar in Britain, but I mean that seems a long way away at the moment. So in terms of infrastructure, in terms of fuel dependency, these nations are very well placed as well, particularly Russia and Brazil. And of course, because India and China have taken up this agreement with them and have this summit and have a cooperative relationship with them, they're obviously going to benefit from that oil. The third reason is currency. China is undoubtedly in the healthiest financial position of the four nations. The United States is the biggest debt nation in history, as I just mentioned, whereas China has a minute amount of external debt, a rampant growing economy, and most importantly, it's the world's biggest creditor by a considerable distance. It's got current estimated currency reserves equal to $305 billion. Russia's fourth place on this list, and if you actually have a look at this list, it's noticeable that the top 6 biggest creditor nations in the world are China and Russia from the BRIC nations, Japan, another emerging eastern economy, Saudi Arabia, the world's second biggest oil producer, and Switzerland, which is fiercely independent, a huge holder of gold, and a nation with direct democracy and an independence from the Eurozone. The United Kingdom is 193rd on the list, and the United States is 196th on the list, out of 196. And the source of this information was the United States Central Intelligence Agency. So they can't come back and say, oh, that's not true, or it's inaccurate, or it's biased, or it's propaganda. It comes from their own government agencies. The fourth reason, that I just want to discuss very briefly, is energy. China involved in the building of huge infrastructure projects such as nuclear power and various power stations. In fact, the industrialisation in China has been so rapid that it now features many of the world's most polluted cities, which is obviously a very negative thing for the people, but it doesn't really have any impact on their economic status, which has greatly benefited from this rapid industrialisation. The fifth reason is gold and the possession of gold. The BRIC nations have rampantly invested in gold recently, at a time when we see that fiat currencies are incredibly vulnerable and devaluing, and recently even the Swiss franc has become pegged to the euro, which ended in April 2011 HSB described as the last safe haven for currency. Gold is considered to be a store of value, essentially. I'm not going to go into all the reasons for why that is. I might do that in a future programme. But in this massively inflationary environment that exists at the moment, with every fiat currency vulnerable due to the massive amounts of debt that I've just discussed, it's often asserted that physical commodities represent the only viable safe haven. Now, it's also often argued that the best commodities really relate to infrastructure, and that gold in itself doesn't have any practical uses, therefore it's the least valuable commodity. That may be a valid argument, but what is likely is that these commodities, including gold, will increase significantly in value relative to the world's major currencies, particularly the dollar, whose position is hugely precarious, as is its position as the world's reserve currency, but I will be discussing that in due course. In May 2011, the Financial Times reported that China had set a new standard for the purchasing of gold, becoming the world's biggest buyer, acquiring 93.5 tonnes between January and March, a 55% increase from the previous quarter and more than double the level a year earlier, according to data released by the World Gold Council. China has also been the world's biggest miner of gold since 2008. As well as advising its citizens to buy both gold and silver, China has rapidly increased its gold holdings, becoming the 6th largest holder of gold amongst nations in 2011. James Dine, a market analyst, trader and investor, stated in August 2011, "People in Washington still don't understand that unless they balance that trade, the Chinese are going to wind up owning the whole world. They don't need a communist revolution, they'll just buy it. The function of gold is to balance, make sure that you take in as much as you spend, and they've castrated the dollar long ago. We are headed for real trouble somewhere ahead." Just to explain, the United States is still a very big holder of gold, but as it's really related to the repatriation of gold, in that there's theoretically a lot of gold that has been that exists only in the form of paper receipts, essentially. And the actual supply of physical gold to support those paper receipts is pretty minimal. And this is why you've heard people talking about crash JP Morgan buy silver, because JP Morgan has promised all these silver contracts based on physical supply of silver, and it doesn't actually have any of the physical products. It just has promises written on a piece of paper. So when this all unfolds, and when the dollar is devalued by the massive inflationary environment that's going to reduce, then the value of gold is going to increase massively. Now, with all these nations, I'm going to go on to discussing the extent to which India have been buying gold as well. They will have huge amounts of this commodity and no external debt and no vulnerability to any of these currency imbalances. It's going to put them in a very strong position. That's why this guy's talking about them castrating the dollar. If that's not entirely clear, I'm going to play a video in due course that hopefully will make it a bit clearer and explain some of the issues related to it. China has actually been overtaken recently as the world's biggest buyer of gold by India. It was reported in August 2011 that India was set to import between 950 and 1,000 metric tons of gold during 2011. The previous year saw India import 958 tons, according to the World Gold Council, the highest level of Indian imports of the commodity ever seen. In relation to this trend, economist David Gartman stated, "Gold is the currency of the world at the moment, with the world convinced that the monetary and fiscal authorities are likely to do nothing right and everything wrong when it comes to resolving the world's current fiscal problems." In March 2009, the Daily Telegraph reported on Arkady Dvorkovich, the Russian Kremlin's chief economic advisor, commenting that Russia would like to see a return to a gold-backed currency. The Telegraph noted that the world's first fiat paper currencies have lacked any external anchor ever since Nixon abandoned the gold standard. It is widely argued that the financial excesses and extreme debt leverage of the last quarter century would have been impossible, or at least less likely, under the discipline of gold. Russia is also the world's fifth largest miner of gold, and IMF data indicates that Russia continues to increase its bullion stocks over recent years, becoming the 8th largest national holder of the commodity recently. And in August 2011, Reuters reported that Russia's central banks were to begin offering gold-backed loans. Brazil's Amazonian region is also fundamentally associated with gold mining, and Brazil remains the 15th biggest gold producer in the world. Also, it's noticeable, as I mentioned earlier, the BRIC nations have associated themselves with South Africa, the second largest producer of gold in the world. In August 2011, Hugo Chavez's Venezuela chose to repatriate $11 billion from the Bank of England, $11 billion of gold. Reuters reported that Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez said on Wednesday he would repatriate $11 billion in gold reserves held in foreign banks and diversify the liquid reserves away from Western nations and into emerging powers like China, Russia and Brazil. Venezuela is not one of the world's biggest gold holders, but it is the 13th largest among nations, and Chavez's decision to nationalise the commodity, along with the fact that it's the 11th biggest oil producing nation in the world, and as I was discussing last week, has the world's biggest oil reserves, predictably led to much US-driven propaganda against Chavez, which is only likely to increase now that his allegiance with these BRIC nations has been made clear. Meanwhile, other emerging nations such as Mexico are also upping their gold reserves and dumping the US dollar. Reuters stated precisely this in May 2011. Mexico massively ramped up its gold reserves in the first quarter of this year, buying over $4 billion of bullion as emerging economies move away from the ailing US dollar, which has dipped to 2.5-year lows. So, as I was saying, there are several European nations and the United States among the biggest holders of gold, but every single one of these nations has huge external debts. It's quite likely that at some point the European economies will be forced to sell their gold reserves, or at least some of them, to emerging economies, as Britain chose to do approximately a decade ago, very stupidly. And as and when these countries are forced to deplete their gold reserves, they'll be left with few assets of value, considering they'll have fiat currencies that are depreciating in value, huge amounts of government debt, many, with again Britain being a prime example, are reliant, for example, on the importation of food. And the only European nation among the top 20 oil producers in the world is Britain, although we still import a great deal of oil. As stated previously, Europe's hugely dependent on Russian oil exportation, and the desire to exploit and control major reserves and producers of crude oil has been obviously reflected in this UK and US foreign policy for decades. eventually we're going to reach the point, and indeed we're reaching it now, where there are no more major oil producing countries that it's feasible for the Anglo-American establishment to demonise and then invade militarily. At that point, both nations are going to be in an extremely tricky predicament, considering that the US economy in particular is completely centred around oil and gas. We'll have a devaluing currency that, I mean, everything is being done presently to prop up the dollar, but if the inflationary environment and if the debt-ridden environment continues, with quantitative easing taking place now every single month in the United States, then the chances of inflation continuing, increasing, and even becoming rabid is pretty high. And at that point, they'll no longer be able to import oil, or they may not be able to import it to the degree that they wish to do so. If they can't do that, they're finished, the economy's finished. It'll be exactly the same situation in Britain, and the knock-on effect is going to be absolutely massive. It would definitely be the end of America being the world reserve currency, which gives the United States big economic advantages, but I'll come on to discussing that in a second. According to China's National Foreign Exchanges Administration, China's gold reserves have recently increased. Currently, the majority of its gold reserves have been located in the US and European countries. The US and Europe have always suppressed the rising price of gold. They intend to weaken gold's function as an international reserve currency. They don't want to see other countries turn to gold reserves instead of the US dollar or euro. Therefore, suppressing the price of gold is very beneficial for the US in maintaining the US dollar's role as the international reserve currency. China's increased gold reserves will thus act as a model and lead other countries towards reserving more gold. Large gold reserves are also beneficial in promoting the internationalization of the renminbi. That's the Chinese currency. So, as I was saying, the level of quantitative easing that's taking place now, particularly in the United States, is only going to serve to weaken the currency. And it's only going to serve to hasten the arrival of the United States losing its reserve currency status. When it does lose its reserve currency status, the BRIC nations, they're already putting pressure on now, as I'll come to in a second, but they're going to really ramp up the pressure and say, well, we need to be in charge. Look what's happened on the Anglo-American establishment's watch. Everything's fallen to pieces. The dollar's crashed completely. They can't even pay their own social security. We need a new global financial system that's even more integrated, but we need to be at the top of it. And that's what they're essentially pushing for. The sixth and final reason they're in a strong position, which I'll just mention briefly as well, is that the BRIC nations are among the world's biggest holders of foreign currencies. China is by a huge distance the world's largest holder of foreign currencies, double that of the second largest holder, Japan, 5 times more than any other nation, the next largest being Russia, and 3 times more than the entire European Union. All of the BRIC nations rank in the top 7 national holders of foreign currency, and the remaining positions in the top 10 feature Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, or the People's Republic of China as they prefer to call it now, Republic of Korea, Hong Kong and Singapore. Switzerland is the only sovereign European nation in possession of significant foreign currency reserves. These reserves are typically held in the denomination of reserve currencies, usually the dollar, but sometimes also sterling, the euro or yen. Consequently, it is hardly surprising that according to the United States Department of the Treasury, China is the world's biggest holder of US treasuries, with Brazil and Russia also figuring highly in the list. So again, this puts the United States and Europe in a hugely vulnerable position, with particularly the US, but I mean Britain's so obviously tied to the US economy and the US dollar that it would equally apply to Britain. With China holding all the US treasuries, holding all this US debt, constantly saying, well, we're not really happy with the dollar being the world reserve currency. So you can see that the potential for them to really bring down the United States essentially is quite high. So what we're seeing now with all the austerity that's taking place across Europe at the moment, and the rioting that's accompanied it, is just a desperate attempt to keep this existing economic, globalised, Anglo-American-led system going by the people that really benefit from it. When I say the people that really benefit from it, I just mean the vested interests in the United States, Britain and Europe. It's the pattern of austerity and rioting is something we've seen before in Latin America, particularly Argentina. And hopefully at some point I'll do a programme just about Argentina and the IMF and the crisis that ensued there, because there are a lot of parallels to what is occurring in Europe, mainland Europe in particular, at the moment. However, the current situation was aptly summed up in an interview by Max Kaiser, so I'm just going to briefly play that video and hopefully will also explain some of the other issues that I was discussing earlier in a more succinct way.
So, Max, are you saying that Washington is not involved in this whole thing? I mean, you seem to be saying that really this is a mess made by Wall Street here.
Well, Washington is a peripheral player now. We see this all over the world, whether it's IMF is now pulling the strings in Europe. They're also pulling the strings in Washington. Christine Lagarde, as a matter of fact, said, who's the new chief of the IMF, that the extraordinary privilege the extravagant privilege of the U.S. dollar that's been enjoyed since World War II is now at risk as the U.S. dollar loses its world reserve currency. So the world is adjusting. The dollar will lose its status as world reserve currency. The U.S. debt will lose the AAA rating, and it's a complete different configuration. And Washington is not the biggest player in this. The global bankers are the biggest players, the global hedge fund managers, and that's where the action, that's who's determining the outcome of this, not the players in Washington. They have already ceded control to the global banking industry.
Well, what is the next level? I mean, if you're saying that we're going to get down rate, if the dollar's going to turn into trash, if it's not well on its way there already, what is the next level? How do you get out of this mess?
Well, the way you get out of this mess is you need to accept the fact that the dollar is in a bubble and needs to be marked down by 50 or 60%. You need to take the hit, similar to what Iceland did. They said, look, we can't, we're not going to spend the rest of our time in the indentured servitude position from these bankers. We need to take the hit and let the krona collapse. The U.S., if they were being managed by somebody who knew something about economics and not Barack Obama, who's financially illiterate, they would allow the dollar to collapse against other currencies, let the economy go through 2 or 3 years of a gut-wrenching depression, and then come out of it and rebuild, and keep their sovereignty intact.
So you're saying shock therapy is the way to go?
To keep your sovereignty. Otherwise, America will end up like Greece, losing their sovereignty. America will end up like other countries in the Eurozone, like Ireland, that's lost its sovereignty to the IMF and these other banking institutions. I think most Americans would prefer to be sovereign and free than to be a vassal state of international bankers.
But
Max,
Barack Obama, by not
explaining this to him.
I'm sorry to interrupt there, but if, yes, I'm sure Americans do not want to see the loss of their sovereignty, but at the same time, most average folks out there, I mean, I don't know if they could see this going any worse. We have 14.1 million unemployed. We have 44 million on food stamps. I mean, how much worse is it going to get if we do this shock therapy approach?
It's not, they have, this hasn't even begun to unfold in terms of the tragedy of the economy here in the U.S. because it's all about prices. The price of gas and food in America, and particularly the price of gas, will triple from its current level. And this is what people have to understand. This is going to happen regardless of what Obama does or John Boehner does. The global currency grid, the fiat money system is collapsing. This is what gold and silver are telling us. And gas has been artificially cheap for decades through subsidies coming out of government through the banking system, as well as all these wars of convenience that the U.S. wages in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is all just murder for hire by the oil industry to keep the price of gas down, to keep the man on the street calm and subdued. But the lid's coming off the kettle, and now the gas prices are going to be $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 a gallon, like it is in Europe. And then we'll start to see some real action. But that's baked into the cake, as I said before. That's not, nothing that anyone can do is going to stop this, because the post-World War II era of adding debt to finance growth climaxed in 2007. No amount of debt can stimulate any growth to pay this debt, because the economy has reached debt saturation. No amount of additional debt, and this is all the plan that Obama and Boehner are putting forward, is to restructure the debt or add to the debt. That's not going to create enough growth to pay down the debt. Therefore, ipso facto, as night follows day, this downward spiral of U.S. bonds, U.S. credit rating, and the U.S. economy is not going to be interrupted by anyone or any policy.
So what he's talking about there with the US dollar losing its reserve currency status, obviously the international powers would then propose that there should be a replacement to this existing financial paradigm that has existed right back to what I was discussing at the start of the programme last week, since the Bretton Woods Agreement. And at the G8 meeting in Aquila, Italy, on the 10th of July 2009, President Medvedev of Russia revealed a new proposed global currency, actually held up this coin that he stated would be the new global currency. Now, I don't know what the significance of that was. I don't know whether it really is going to be the global currency. I don't know why he did that. I don't know. We can only speculate as to what the reasons were and what the exact intention of that propaganda was. But it was certainly very interesting that he chose to do this at a G8 meeting. Russia, the only member of the G8 out of the BRIC nations, so kind of an outsider in a way. Not really entirely sure why they were invited to attend in the first place, but or to be part of in the first place. But obviously he meant that as a significant gesture. Now, what exactly he was saying by doing that, I don't know, but it's something that we should pay attention to. And of course what the BRIC nations hope to do, particularly China, is simply step into this void of the US dollar being replaced as the world reserve currency when it occurs and assume the position of global hegemony. Except China is going to be an even bigger superpower than the United States for several reasons. The first reason is it's got a vast population. They place a huge importance on education in their culture. It's a completely, as I was saying, autocratic, increasingly technocratic, state-driven, one-party state in which there is total indoctrination of the population to accept this and to not even question what is going on, to not even think there could even conceivably be any other alternative. There's a BBC article in which they talk about, recently it was written, and in this article they talk about how Chinese people see the state as being an extension of themselves. Obviously that's a very different attitude to what British and American people and European people, how they would view the state. Maybe we haven't been critical enough of the establishment in this country generally, but I don't think many people see the state as an extension of themselves. We don't have that kind of uncritical relationship with it, or not that uncritical. So I think one of the arguments against China becoming an economic powerhouse, an economic superpower, it's often been said, and some people that know a great deal about economics continue to say this, that essentially they produce cheap goods for the Western market. They're a huge producer of goods and then they export them, and they're reliant on being on Western nations, European nations, taking imports of Chinese goods and then paying them. And if we can't, and if European nations flounder, and if America flounders, and if Britain flounders, and it no longer has a powerful currency, and it can no longer import these products, then the Chinese economy is going to be seriously dented. The first thing to say about that is this may or may not be the case. Don't forget, China can support themselves on what they've got for quite a long time, and they're not broke, and they're not going to go broke for quite a considerable period of time, because they're carrying a small amount of debt, and they've got all these commodities, and they've got all this strong allegiance they made with all these other commodity producing powers that I've just been discussing. So they can absorb some sort of financial crisis. This is the problem for Britain, for the United States, for Europe, is that we can't absorb a financial crisis. That's precisely why you're seeing such insane activity in the world at the moment, because we're teetering on the brink of a precipice at all times with this vast amount of debt. It's only the fact that the economic institutions, which are run by the same people that actually benefit from what's going on, it's only the fact they haven't downgraded the credit rating of nations, particularly. I mean, they have downgraded them to a certain extent, and some of the European nations have been downgraded virtually to junk status now. But really, Britain should be at junk status. America should be at junk status, because they can't ever even come close to paying back their liabilities, not unless their currencies are completely devalued, which, as I've been explaining over the last couple of weeks, is what I expect to see happen. So that's one argument, and the second argument is that China is now buying up all of Europe. They've already been very heavily buying various things in Greece when the Greece economy was collapsing, when the IMF was imposing austerity measures on Greece. And I just want to play a video to you about Chinese investment in Bordeaux vineyards, which is just another example of the way that China is buying up infrastructure in Europe.
A bottle of Bordeaux will cost you about $500. if you try to buy it in mainland China right now. It's not a surprise. Wealthy Chinese investors are going to the source and actually buying up chateaus and vineyards across France's wine-growing regions. It's a big investment, and Sarah Eisen has more.
Margaret, just the latest sign of the global power shift. Chinese investors, yes, scooping up estates and vineyards across Bordeaux. Richard Shen is a good example. He's the CEO of a Chinese fine jewelry store that he purchased a chateau back in February. There he is with Chinese film star Zhang Ji. She's a big fan of his wine. Now, he plans to sell the estate's 2009 vintage for $238 a bottle in mainland China. And Bordeaux has been a hotspot for China. In fact, it's the most popular type of wine right now, known, of course, for its great reds. 10 more deals like this one. Chinese buyers, French chateaus, are currently in the pipeline. All of this according to Bloomberg Pursuits magazine. Now, the Chinese are buying as demand for expensive Bordeaux in China soars. Mainland consumers swallowing almost 20% of Bordeaux's exports in the last year, ending October 31st. And that is a 122% jump from the year before. All of this according to the Bordeaux Wine Council. It makes China the biggest importer of Bordeaux wines by volume, just beating out Germany. Chinese, of course, also splurging on Rolex watches, Maserati cars, all of Europe's finest. Luxury goods in China surged more than 25% on the mainland in 2011. They only shot up 8% in the U.S. and 7% in Europe. So if this isn't a sign, Margaret, that China's rise is coming and Europe's painful crisis is here, I just don't know what is.
I bet you there are a lot of distressed vineyards and families in Europe right now who need to sell.
They're getting it cheap, no question about it. You know, everybody's looking for China to bail out Europe. I guess in a small part, it's happening.
So at the same time these countries are buying up infrastructure, we're also seeing the means of production, the means of industrial production shifting to these nations, because, of course, we've moved away from a system of everything I was discussing last week: balance of payments, self-sufficiency, people producing their products in their own nations. It's just multinational corporations that produce anything now. They don't. I mean, you know, you could certainly argue that companies that are based in an individual nation, you could argue about how much loyalty they would have to the country or to the people. But multinationals have no compunction, because all they care about is profit, and they have no reason to feel any loyalty to a particular nation. So there's a video on YouTube which is called General Motors is Becoming China Motors, which I'm not going to play to you because it's reliant on looking at text, but it's worth looking up. And this is just one of the ways, one example of the way in which corporations being incentivized to switch to China in a very unfair way in many ways. And some of the arrangements related to the Kyoto Protocol and some of the environmental agreements that have been put in place greatly favour these so-called emerging economies. So that's another issue. And of course, another reason that China is more competitive than the United States, and this is not a particularly great reason, and it's not something that is to be admired, but you know, we have to really acknowledge it as being the case, is that, you know, their workers simply demand a lot less than American workers and European workers, and it's good. It's good that European workers and American workers demand something. It's good the labour market hasn't collapsed completely, although it's pretty damn bad. But you know, Chinese workers work for less, they work harder, they're dedicated, they do what they're told, they don't unionise, they don't ask questions, and so on and so forth. And this is why they're ideal for corporations, you know. I mean, it's not just in China, it's not just in India where this is the case. I saw a programme recently on the BBC, just flicking through the channels, and I happened to see it, and despicable programme as usual from the BBC, where they took some kids to the Philippines and showed them the conditions that Filipino people live in, which are atrocious, and I don't think people should be complacent about it. I don't think people should, you know, I don't think they should be shielded from it. And in a way, you could take them out there and do something positive. Had the tone and emphasis of the programme been completely different. But what they failed to explain at any stage was that all the appalling conditions they saw, classrooms absolutely packed full of children, people begging on the streets and with no food, no money, and just living in absolute destitution, and the people that are in the best position in the society had a job in a factory where their job was they had to wrap a bit of wire in a coil round. There was like a coil, and they had to wrap a bit of wire around it, and put that one down and do the next one. Then put that one down and do the next one. And they were saying, how many of these can they do in a minute? And they were saying 100. And for that, they were paid an absolutely derisory wage. And the person they'd taken, I mean, why this woman agreed to do this, I have no idea. But she was speaking to the sort of manager of the factory, and they were saying, you know, is the wage that's paid to these people acceptable? And he said, yeah, it is, because it's above what the government says we have to pay them. And was this challenged? No, it wasn't challenged at all. And at no stage was it explained to the children that it doesn't actually have to be like this. The whole tone of the programme was saying to them, well, don't complain about how much stuff you've got. Don't complain about the fact that you have to go away to university for 3 years, run up a massive debt, and at the end of it, you're not even guaranteed a job in Tesco's, because, you know, you could be in the Philippines in a squat somewhere. You know, that's just the natural order of things. You know, obviously, it's not the natural order of things. It's a complete product of the insane economic cronyism and rabid corporate fascism and phenomenally vicious banking system that has been built over centuries, but particularly intensified in the period that I've been talking about. Was this explained to them? No, of course it wasn't. So it's not just China that has a labour force that would be considered ideal for corporations, but it's, again, this is another strong factor that would indicate why they're going to be in a strong economic position. So there are all these factors that would point to the fact that BRICs are going to be in a position to take over the quote-unquote world order. Of course, ultimately, the same forces benefit either way. You know, China and the BRIC nations aren't talking about dismantling the world economic order or the institutions and infrastructure that I've been talking about in the last 2 weeks. They just want to lead this infrastructure. If anything, they want to expand it. The same cabal of unaccountable private overseas banks will win either way, because they control the economy, they control the political culture, they print the money, etc., etc. That is why there is the Jefferson quotation that I read earlier. It's why there's the oft-quoted Rothschild quote about them not caring who makes the country's laws if they control the currency. This international banking corporate structure and the big players in it don't mind seeing these two power blocks fighting it out any more than they cared about the Cold War. They win either way unless we all get blown to smithereens, in which case I bet their contingency plan is better than yours and better than mine. So what we're really seeing now, as I was discussing last week, is the traditional Anglo-American power structure desperately trying to keep control of this global structure and keep their hegemony in the world going. So with the Federal Reserve now quantitative easing every month, and you know, sooner or later we're going to see engagement with Syria, and then probably Iran, and they've been trying to overthrow the Syrian government by semi-covert means, but that seems to be failing. So we'll probably see military action at some point. Although they're now saying they're going to arm the rebels, although they've already been given the military aid. So what the difference between arming them and giving them military aid? You know, it's pretty much a redundant difference, in my opinion. So they're just doing everything they can to prop up their oil-driven, dollar-funded paradigm. And the BRIC nations are preparing themselves to pull the rug from under the Anglo-American establishment. It's all building towards a rather nasty standoff over Iran, essentially. I'm not going to speculate on that too much because I don't want to be putting out doom porn, but I will be discussing Iran in a few weeks' time, possibly a couple of weeks' time. I will just say briefly that in the BBC film Threads that was made in the 1980s, in which there's a full-scale nuclear war and we see the effects of nuclear warheads on the city of Sheffield and the complete breakdown of society that occurs because of it. This was almost, in that particular film, that the situation regarding a standoff over Iran between Russia and the United States was the precise situation that led to this full-scale nuclear war. I'm not saying anything like that will happen. You know, I believe that the powers of financial capitalism, the powers of crony banking system and so forth will always find a way to resolve matters relatively peacefully, keeping things intact and keeping us as their slaves. Or that will be their ideal scenario. But there was a situation during the Cuban Missile Crisis where we came incredibly close to being blown to smithereens, where we were one word away from full-scale nuclear war happening. And if it wasn't for a guy called Vasily Arkhipov, who overrode the decision-making on a particular nuclear submarine, then Russia would have fired, Soviet Union I should say, would have fired nuclear weapons at the United States, well, nuclear-tipped weapons from a submarine, that almost certainly would have resulted in a full-scale nuclear war. And, you know, I never would have been, almost certainly we never would have been here to sit here and make this discussion. So, you know, I don't think we should wallow in misery, and I don't think we should wallow in negative things, but at the same time, you know, this is just a historical fact. It's not a historical fact that people like to focus on. It's not a historical fact that I've ever heard anyone who was alive at that time ever mention or ever discuss. It's just swept under the carpet, and I can understand that, but, you know, we have to acknowledge that this is the case, in my opinion. This emerging structure of the world that I've been discussing in the early years of the 21st century was almost entirely accurately described by the immensely influential figure in American politics, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I mentioned last week, in his most famous and significant publication, The Grand Chessboard. I think this was published in 1998. It was certainly published in the late 1990s. Brzezinski predicted and advocated the development of a trans-Eurasian security system, which would encompass an extended NATO connected by a cooperative charter with Russia and China as well as Japan. Brzezinski also foresaw a series of conferences by all European and Asian states that would eventually begin the process of institutionalizing a transcontinental security system. Brzezinski then went on to envisage the following. In time, a more formal structure could begin to take shape, prompting the emergence of a trans-Eurasian security system that for the first time would span the entire continent. Such a broad transcontinental security framework could also contain a standing security committee composed of the major Eurasian entities in order to ensure the ability to promote effective cooperation on issues critical to global stability. America, Europe, China, Japan, a confederated Russia and India, as well as perhaps some other countries, might serve together as the core of such a more structured transcontinental system. The eventual emergence of TESS, which is this system he's referring to, could gradually relieve America of some of its burdens, even while perpetuating its decisive role as Eurasia's. Notice he uses the word Eurasia. No one else uses the word Eurasia ever because it doesn't exist. Eurasia exists in 1984. This is one of the three power blocks that exists. Even while perpetuating its decisive role as Eurasia's stabiliser and arbitrator. Brzezinski also acknowledges that America's global predominance would fade and would be unlikely to be replicated by any single state. He then asked the rhetorical question of what will replace the geostrategic primacy which America has enjoyed, as asserted by the title of the book. Brzezinski then goes on to outline a structure about which he seems incredibly enthusiastic. A prolonged phase of gradually expanding cooperation with key Eurasian partners, both stimulated and arbitrated by America, can also help to foster the preconditions for an eventual upgrading of the existing and increasingly antiquated UN structures. These efforts will have the added historical advantage of benefiting from the new web of global linkages that is growing exponentially outside the more traditional nation-state system. That web, woven by multinational corporations, non-governmental organisations with many of them transnational in character, and scientific communities, being reinforced by the internet, already creates an informal global system that is inherently congenial to more institutionalised and inclusive global cooperation. In the course of the next several decades, a functioning structure of global cooperation, based on geopolitical realities, could thus emerge and gradually assume the mantle of the world's current regent, which has for the time being assumed the burden of responsibility for world stability and peace. Geostrategic success in that cause, would represent a fitting legacy of America's role as the first, only and last truly global superpower. So this passage makes utterly clear what is meant by political consensus. It's an expanding cooperation leading to an upgrading of the United Nations structures, which will be aided by the fact that there's already a huge multinational system in place, which involves a web of multinational corporations and transnational government institutions. So, according to Brzezinski, an informal global system already exists, but this system should be institutionalised by global cooperation. As is usual of members of the political or economic elite, Brzezinski is making the emergence of this system sound like an accident, where of course we should know by now that it was envisaged, planned, facilitated and built quite deliberately. Brzezinski's statements are simply an advocacy of a system of world government, an admission that a system of transnational or even global governance already exists, that it has been driven by corporations and banking, and that it would be preferable to cement this further by formalising it with treaties and legislation. And it's worth noting that Brzezinski has been this massively influential political figure who endorsed Obama as a presidential candidate and acted as a foreign policy advisor to him during his electoral campaign. The structure that he's talking about is not going to be a political consensus and global system that brings peace on earth and goodwill to all men. It's going to be a corporate banking consensus, a worldwide amalgamation of the structure that I've described over the last 2 weeks, a commingled superstructure of banking, military and industrial interests. This will be coupled with an increasing watering down of the influence of national governments in favour of expanding transnational governance, possibly in time global governance, with possibly even one central political authority that issues diktats to the entire planet, to whom all individual governments and even existing transnational authorities such as the European Parliament are completely subordinate. This is the dream of the real power that exists in the world, not politicians, but the corporate banking structure that's behind them, which controls the the direction of decision making in the entire world. So what I've been discussing over these last 2 weeks, and what Brzezinski has discussed here, this is the nature of the global society and economic system that exists. This is how it was created, and this is what impact it has on the events that we're seeing today and where it's headed in the future. So what I'm going to be discussing over the coming weeks is how this system impacts upon our lives, every area of our lives, and how it impacts upon, often completely controls, in fact, many seemingly completely unrelated areas of public and foreign policy. So I'm going to begin next week by discussing the wars in Kosovo, Libya and Syria. So that's really it for today's programme. I've really said all I can for today. I intended for it to be a little bit shorter than this, but it takes time to lay out these arguments, and it takes time to illustrate that what we're seeing happening today is no coincidence. And I felt it was valid to talk about the event that occurred to me this week in terms of fact-checking that paper, because it seemed like a great coincidence or synchronicity. So I'm going to finish finally by just saying that you should visit flippingthepyramid.co.uk if you wish to listen to this programme again. It also should be available on YouTube. And the very last thing I want to say is that don't take anything I've said today for granted. If you don't like something I've said, or if you believe something I've said to be inaccurate, or even if you agree with what I've said, don't take my word for it, look it up for yourself. This has been Breakdown. My name is Chris Morris. I bid you good evening.
We are flipping the pyramid. Flipping the pyramid.